All right, we are covering a weapon that's been on my to-do list for quite a while. It is a part of the what we call the Critsplosion melees, which are essentially just melees with a 6 perk where critical hits activate an explosion, damaging about 43 base damage and a half tile radius, which all that means is your weapon explodes when it crits, and that can do a pretty good amount of extra damage. In fact, we'll get into the math on that later, but what it means in practical terms is the Armaggeddon axe, which is honestly a pretty good, decently high damage, slow-ish swinging axe, turns into an explosion machine that is really, really good for group damage. And that's one of the things that sort of limits melees is when you are up close and personal and you don't have that ranged attack, you have to be right there in the face of the enemies. Attacking as many enemies in one group is a very, very important thing to have, especially in encampments or in any situation where you're getting swarmed. On single targets like a smasher or a mist monster, it can be a little tougher with a weapon like the Armaggeddon because that explosion does do some good extra damage, but it's much more better in a crowd. So there are trade-offs with it, of course, but I love the fact that we're even talking about the Armaggeddon because if I'm going to be real with you guys, I don't know that I ever really had this weapon on my to-do list. I've always had sort of a background intention to cover every weapon at some point, but I don't think that this weapon would have been something worth covering without this crit perk. And I'm very glad that it does because pretty much every melee that got this crit perk has become somewhat improved. And I'm going to link a bunch of those videos down below if you guys want to check out some of the other videos. There are definitely quite a few installments in this sort of sub-series of the best perks playlist. So without further ado, obviously you've been seeing some gameplay. Let's get into it. Now, I'm not going to lay too heavily into the math, but I did say I'd cover it, so let's just sort of get into that right now. I'll talk about the loadout that we're using right after this, but this is sort of a DPS spreadsheet that we use, made by me and a friend, and this is essentially what the math boils down to. This is some of the best melees in the entire game, used with standard perks that I call out in my videos. Obviously, golden standards are like a Ravager with triple attack speed and Luna is going to be hitting for way harder than the Armaggeddon axe, but we're not talking about a top-tier melee in this video. We're talking about a fun alternative if you're just trying to try something out. And I will tell you, you do not need to be hitting for 400,000 DPS to have a good time. That is extremely overkill when it comes to regular missions. It's definitely great for 160s, but if you're just having a good time, the 192,000 DPS we're getting is actually pretty good. And I'm going to be pulling out the calculator because I freeze-framed a lot of the gameplay, and the crit explosions range from like 46,000 damage to like 80,000. And on a physical target without eating coconuts, I was doing about 80,000 damage with the crit explosion, and I won't be including the damage to other enemies in the area around you, but just know that that does matter as well. If you just take this and you consider that you're critting about 60% of the time, you can essentially just add about 48,000 or 50,000 DPS. For easy math, we'll just call it 48 here, and you can essentially say that the DPS on the Armaggeddon is more like 240,000, which doesn't move it way up the list, but it is something worth considering. Not to mention, like I said, that extra explosion damage is affecting enemies in a crowd. So you're not just doing 80,000 of the target that you're attacking, you're doing 80,000 to everything around you. And that is definitely evident when you go up to a crowd of enemies and then they disappear after the first swing, which I got a lot of gameplay of for you guys today. It's a super satisfying feeling, and that is why I talk about DPS not being the most important thing, because yes, I know there are better alternative melees, but if you're just trying to have a good time, you're going to have a really good time with the Armaggeddon, or any melee for that matter that has the crit explosion perk. Now, I mentioned I get into the loadout. Let's cover it here. So obviously you have Luna. She is way too good not to use. I would recommend, if you are using this weapon to its fullest extent, totally rocking out might be a better way to go, but I like to use a standardized Luna loadout just because she's consistent and easy and is what I've used in a lot of other videos, but totally rocking out would be a very good alternative in the lead. And then I might even suggest maybe corrosive strikes in the lead instead of Luna, because without the amount of health that Blast from the Past gives you, it's not quite as worth it anymore, but that's all personal preference. You guys can sort of figure it out from there. Another hero I sometimes use is Dennis Jr. for axes, because eliminations have an 11% chance to up your attack speed and damage, which is definitely a good perk, but he was often in Expedition and it wasn't that big of a deal, so I'm not using him right now, but he's definitely a good pick. There are lots of good options. If you want a good ninja loadout video, down below. It's older, but still plenty accurate. Even though I don't think Totally Rockin' Out existed at the time, it still covers all of the good melee heroes that would be helpful in your journey, including anatomy lessons. Whiteout Fiona is critical. I don't think she's necessary in the lead, but that extra crit rating goes a long way, and it ups us from like a 40-something% chance to crit to a whopping 60.5% chance to crit. You are actually critting more times than not with this weapon, and it is very, very evident when you play. And then, of course, we just got Coconut, South Thief, Saurian Hide. Pretty standard stuff here that I use in almost every single melee video, but it all comes together to make for a pretty satisfying experience. So, obviously, if you're running the Armaggeddon, let's talk about the best perks for it, and you might be a little surprised at some of my choices here. Now, I'm not saying that these are the best perks. This is kind of what I like to use if I'm just trying to, you know, encourage a weapon's playability, meaning this thing has crit explosions, I want crit rating. Is that the highest damage output? Not necessarily. If you want to do the most damage with Armaggeddon, then double attack speed with Luna would be your best choice. However, as I've mentioned several times already, this is a for fun build, so you definitely want to have the crit rating on that, activating these explosions as much as possible. Again, if you're trying to maximize damage, Affliction and damage to afflicted would actually be more helpful to you in general, but if you're going that route, there are the weapons. So I actually go for the damage to miss monsters and bosses because they are going to give you the most trouble, and I think it's most worth it to run this 5th perk just for those bigger targets. The element is energy, just because it's kind of good all around. I don't really think it super matters which element you put on this. I'm just going to leave it energy as default, and I don't really think that there are any other good options there. And attack speed is just super necessary. Even though I say this weapon is for fun, you got to get your damage from somewhere, and by having a higher attack speed, you are activating those explosions a lot more often, and it just makes for a smoother experience. The faster swinging you have with your melees, the more fun or easy it is to use in general. And then, of course, the damage perk. There's not really much of another option here. The heavy attack is super underwhelming. I barely got any gameplay for it because it does more damage, but it slows you down, makes you clunky. I got hit by a smasher and almost thrown off the map again, so I didn't really like that very much. There are definitely other melees with more interesting heavy attacks than this one. I don't think you ever need to actually use it, so an extra damage perk here is definitely a perfectly fine way to go. And then as for the other 6 perks, generating shields isn't the most necessary. Again, even if you're going to be running Totally Rockin' Out where you'd actually have a shield and this might be useful, you're probably just going to want to have crits on this because Totally Rockin' Out would be activating it a lot. And if you are using Totally Rockin' Out, I would actually recommend a crit damage perk up here over the crit rating. I'd still recommend the attack speed personally speaking, but a second crit damage perk would maximize your, you know, crit damage output. But if you're not swinging that fast, it doesn't really matter how much you're critting. The math on that might vary, but math is one thing and real world slow swinging axes are another. I can't really consider running a weapon without an attack speed perk personally, but if you want to go through with it, you can do what you want to do. That's basically my recommendation though, is running crit damage over the crit rating, because Totally Rockin' Out will be adding more than enough crit rating in my opinion, and you should be absolutely good to go, just like this video. So that's the Armaggeddon. Honestly, a significantly better axe than I would have ever imagined. Obviously, I never really gave it a chance before the crit explosion was a thing, but I am pleasantly surprised to say that we have a nice old weapon in our hands that you might have never even thought twice about. If you guys want to support the channel, feel free to use code Mista at your checkout. I usually type it in, but I've been supporting Archer recently, so I really appreciate it if you guys want to help me make these videos. And if you guys want to hang out on Twitch, link down below. I made this whole video in a stream, so shouts to them for hanging out. I'll see you guys in the next one, and yeah, have a nice day. And then